All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Luna, and I'm from the Oxford FinTech and Legal Tech Society. And to my left is Tian, who's going to help me moderate this discussion this evening. So first off, I want to thank you all for coming and spending your Monday evening with us for the Social Dilemma panel discussion on the regulation ethics of AI and big data. Just a few points on housekeeping before we start. This event is split into two parts, the majority being the panel discussion, followed by a short 10 to 15 minute Q&A section. We are recording this session and we'll make it available on the OFLS YouTube channel, or if you would like a private copy, you can always message us on Facebook or LinkedIn. We encourage you to take part and ask as many questions as you want, but please do so in the Q&A box, and I'll be handling the Q&A section at the end. So as you can clearly see, we have an exceptional lineup for you today. Jeff Wolowski, Director of the Social Dilemma and producer for Exposure Labs, which aims to tell stories in order to inspire social change. Dr. Silvia Milano, a research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute, whose work explores philosophical and ethical implications of AI and machine learning. Dr. Brent Mittelstadt, the Senior Research Fellow in Data Ethics at the Oxford Internet Institute, whose work focuses on interpretability and governance of complex algorithmic systems, and Megan Ma, a lecturer in artificial intelligence and law at Sciences Po, who has interest in algorithmic governance and its relationship under the frameworks of quantitative sciences, law, and language. So without further ado, let's get started. Over to you, Tian.
All right, thank you, Lina. All right, I think so. To start off tonight's conversation about social media, I think the first question on many of our heads is really whether or not social media is an effective tool of manipulation. And I think, Jeff, with all you have written about, social media and its influence of people in your documentary, perhaps you'd like to be the first one who answers this question. Jeff, I think you're on mute.
Thank you for that call out. You think I've done this enough times at this point, my goodness. But I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for hosting this and for us all gathering here together right now. I feel like I want to interview all of you and do another whole movie with all of the expertise that we have gathered here. So there's so much wisdom and knowledge with this group. I think to your question, it's funny because this is one of the realizations that we had while making the film, that the social media companies both claim to and deny having the ability to manipulate the public. Like, what the story that they tell the advertisers is that we're really, really great at manipulating the public. You come use our services, you can affect thought amongst the general public with our tools better than any other tools out there. And we've seen from countless examples of leaked stories or leaked experiences of Facebook in Australia, advertising to advertisers that they know when on a young girl, on a woman's cycle, when she is on her cycle, and can know how to manipulate at the right time in a monthly cycle. Like that is a story of what Facebook was pushing out in that country. So the stories of what they say to the advertisers are very different than what they say to the general public around are these tools for manipulation or not. But inherently, I think the mindset that I've come to, and I'm eager to hear from everyone else, they have collected so much data about us and know so much about what engages us, what we like, what we are interested in. And those tools have been used to reverse engineer, to build models around us and to reverse engineer what makes us tick. And that's a very, very powerful tool. And we don't have complete transparency over how that model or how those AI tools are being used for us or against us. But we know that the business model is not in our interests and not designed for the general public, and that we're not the paying customers. So I'll close there. I think those are just some opening thoughts based on your prompt there, Dan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh. I think that's Jeff, I think that's really very interesting. Megan, having done some work on the relationships between language and data itself, what do you think about this issue?
Yeah, I thought that this was a great question. And this argument around manipulation, it parallels the conversation on addiction. And so, in short, of course, the question is yes, and with an asterisk, right? Social media is without a doubt effective at in this regard. It's continuously built in the design with every update. Social media has developed this new language. It's conditioned us to react instantly all the time, and our behavior is driven by this platform. The notifications became our bells as we fell under the Pavlovian spell, right? We salivate at receiving likes for our posts. We grow anxious with the ellipses as we await responses from friends and peers. And external validation, effectively, and sadly, our self worth at times became reframed and represented through symbology and these symbols, right? And of course, something that was really touched upon in the documentary and expressed by some of the interviews that were there is this divorce between humanity and design. This system was built around being persuasive with positive intermittent reinforcement, and the intention was to exploit vulnerability of our cognition. They use this hilarious analogy with the slot machines in Vegas, and there's a nod to the social media as a drug. Um, but I put an asterisk there because should we still consider social media as a tool? And the documentary also talks about this, where they use this bicycle metaphor. And I think it's something along the lines of if something is a tool, it waits patiently, but if something is not a tool, it demands attention. And there's a sort of similar line of argumentation here from Frank Pascal. His most recent work on the new laws of robotics, he talks about sort of the potential of technology to support and complement. The problem is sort of when you move away from being complementary, that's where sort of the loss of control begins. And so right now what we're seeing is this kind of serious accountability gap, again, pointing to Pascal. There's nobody to really enforce who the creator, controller, or owner. There's no responsibility there. And the premise is this thing that Jeff mentioned, that it seems to be a result of unforeseen consequences. There's two stories being told here, and this undercurrent that, you know, there's this unexpected almost these effects, but surely there's a blatant acknowledgement that there's danger around cognitive control. For example, the creation of the like button, it's sort of a cheery expression that we wanted to spread love and support. But what really happened here is it's created a symbol and a metric or quantification on support. It's measuring something that's intangible. So rather than someone, you know, giving you the shoulder and saying like, hey, this is great work, it's my support and my validation is now transformed into a number. And so social media, so these ideas of sort of validation and things like that, they're obviously not new, but social media has become sort of this amplifier. And so what we have to tackle with is how do we manage this new language? So those are some of my early thoughts on it as well. But thank you again.
Yeah, very interesting, Megan. Jeff, would you like to pitch in on this, or Brent and Sylvia as well? Feel free to hop into the conversation.
Yeah, please, Brent and Sylvia.
Yeah, I would jump in quickly. I mean, just to go back to the to the question around whether it's a tool of manipulation or whether it's effective at manipulation. I mean, it's a difficult question because manipulation implies intent, and social media and just platforms in general are certainly designed with effective choice architectures, and they certainly will, let's say, encourage certain behaviors and discourage other ones. But I don't know, manipulation feels nefarious in some way. It feels like there's a grand master plan behind the choices that are being presented to you. And that may be true, but the difficulty we have is that there's very little external access to these systems where those choices or the choice architecture is actually designed, where the bidding for your attention, for example, actually takes place. And so we can measure these things from the outside, but to know whether there's sort of intentional manipulation occurring or not, we can trust the companies or the platform's word for it, but it's very difficult for us to actually determine those things ourselves with the very limited access that researchers or regulators, for that matter, are given to the platform. So Effective at manipulating choice. Well, sorry, effective at encouraging certain choice. Yes, I would say so. But manipulation, I think the jury is still out on that one.
Yeah,
Do you want to add anything there, Sylvia? Yeah.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I have to say I agree with what Brent said, that saying that social media are an effective tool of manipulation seem to imply that there's an intention behind what happens to us online and how this affects our behavior. But I think to some extent, I mean, maybe this ambiguation is in order. So I think in some way, manipulation is intrinsic to any act of communication, right? So when we communicate, when we express something to others, we aim to manipulate the beliefs that they have or how they behave on the basis of that information. And to that extent, I mean, I think social media is not that different. What seems to be especially troubling about social media, that the documentary does a lot to bring that out, is that we see effects that are magnified, as Megan was said, and others. And this doesn't seem, I mean, we don't, as Brent was saying, we don't seem to have clear evidence that this is the effect of intention, that there is a specific design behind it. Rather, it seems the product of how the system is set up, what the incentives are, and the choice of incentives and the system structure may be up to different decisions that, yeah, do not involve a master plan behind. So effective tool of manipulation, I would say no, if we intend in the sense of having a strong intention and driving and being able to create specific effects, but certainly the source of novel phenomena and amplifier, that yes.
May I throw some additional thoughts out there? I want to, if we're framing it as, is it a tool of manipulation or a tool for manipulation? I actually look at it as two different factors. One which Megan sort of teed up around addiction, right? And so there's the choice architecture that's designed into the system, right? So there's one part of the conversation around how are the algorithms actually working in a potentially manipulative way. And I'm completely with you on the intent, but I want to come back to that one for a second. The other part of the conversation around manipulation is, can it be used as a tool of manipulation? Which I think there's a completely different framework around, like, if I wanted to inject political conspiracy theory into fill in the blank country, could I do it through social media platforms? Arguably, that's one of the most effective ways to do it. And I think there's a lot of evidence around how we've seen different conspiracy theories or different types of group activity happen and spread from platform to another platform to another platform in very coordinated and strategic ways. I would also consider that in a manipulative nature. But going to the first part of that, as we were talking about how the platforms are inherently designed, if I am operating an algorithm that's optimized for each and every model, each and every person, every node in the whole system, and if everybody's getting their own custom engagement, and this is where we lose access to, like, what exactly are they being optimized for today? Like, we have heard that they were optimized for engagement in the past, but we don't have full transparency over, like, what is the Twitter or YouTube algorithm optimized for? But the way I look at it more recently is that by giving us a personalized feed that is reverse engineered from our individual models of us, it is basically putting us all on our individual Galapagos island. Like, we are all now in our own individual unique little island. The more that you engage with the algorithm, the faster your own individual evolution transpires. So now I'm going to keep pushing Megan down your path, Sylvia down your path, Brent down your path, Tian. Everybody's going down their own individual evolutionary paths. Now, the algorithm is unmoral, as we're saying, right? There's no morality in the termination of the algorithm, yet the algorithm is still going to give us all different information. And if you compound that over time, right, we have now a decade plus of personalized compound interest of thinking and ideas, pushing us all further and further away from each other. So is there morality being projected into it? As you're saying, absolutely not. Yet, are these systems now manipulating us all away from a shared reality and into our own individual versions of the truth? as our Galapagos Islands are all drifting farther and farther away from each other, I would argue that yes, these are manipulating the way we see and understand the world, especially because there's no morality being applied to it, and that there is nobody, there is no grandmaster of intent behind the whole system. Yet having a rudderless system is causing almost more chaos than having someone at the helm. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, Megan, would you like to pitch in?
Oh, I was just saying that Jeff sort of points to something really incredible, which is actually sort of the depreciating value of expertise. That because we're sort of in our own Galapagos Island, that sort of these realities or these truths that we're experiencing are in part sort of, we're becoming our own experts, and we're sort of validating and reinforcing these beliefs just by, you know, being in our own worlds in effect. So I think that's a really great point.
If I could just throw one more thing in there. I mean, I think an interesting question to ask in this context, and the thing where we don't have a clear answer, I don't even know if we could have a clear answer to this, is how much of that, first off, how widespread is that across different platforms? So is this a problem of personalization itself? Is this a problem of algorithms, let's say? Is it a problem of profiling? Or is this a Facebook problem and, you know, Twitter problem, but actually for other platforms, it's not that bad? I think there's a lot of nuance here that in terms of, to use Jeff's terms, where these islands exist and how far apart they are and how quickly they're expanding, like the universe. I think that's a difficult question to answer, but it's also, aside from like the diversity within the platforms question, to me, it's also a question of how much of this is down to the tool and how much of this is down to just a change, I suppose, in how we think and how we educate ourselves and how people are educated. You know, is this a critical thinking problem? Is this a trust problem? I think there's a lot of components that go into this where it's hard to just say, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not arguing that the tech isn't helping, or I'm not arguing against the idea that the tech is problematic in this sense. It's more just, I think we have to keep in mind all the other contributing factors to this polarization, rather than just pinning it on platforms. I wish we could just pin it on platforms. That'd be fantastic if we could just say, okay, let's regulate the platforms better and then everything will be fixed. But yeah, we can't.
Right. Yeah, I think at this point, the conversation lapses really well into our next question, right? Jeff, just now you mentioned that data is unmoral. And I think our next question really tries to investigate that. And it is whether data is truly neutral or not. It's a very broad-based question, right? Back to you, Jeff.
Oh, I'm eager to hear from everybody else. I think data is, it so depends on how the data is being used, right? Data about my health and my DNA and my body could be really, really valuable to me if my doctor is using it for my interests, or it could be very detrimental to me if an insurance company is using it to determine my insurance rates. So that, like, a one specific data point is neutral in and of itself, in my mind, but how it's being used or applied or manipulated or rendered, like how is that data being turned into something else, is the question. The financial incentives for my data points as processed through Facebook's or Google's you know, capitalist intent is pitting my data against me in many ways. And it might be wrapped around, oh, we're trying to give you a great experience and make you come back and spend more time. But the advertisements and ultimately the way that they build their revenue, the entire financial incentive structure is around data being used not for me, but in some way antagonistically related to me. So I think it really comes down to how is it being used and why.
All right, Brent, Sylvia, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this. So I think I disagree with Jeff on the view that data is neutral. I tend to think that this is almost a trick question.
Yeah.
In the sense that it's a question that we hear so often, but I think it can be tricky for several reasons. One is that it's somewhat ambiguous. So when we say that data is neutral, it's unclear whether we are referring to data as a representation of something. So whether we are questioning whether the quality of the data is good, whether it is a faithful representation of an underlying reality. Or we can be talking about what are the consequences of using this data and making decisions on the basis of this data. And I think that taking this question into different directions can give different answers. So we know that data is socially produced. And so as a representation of social reality, in many ways, it is not neutral. It's not neutral because it's produced by a society that, we have social biases, our societies are not completely just. And so we should expect this data to be also reflective of all of these. And in terms of the consequences, yes, this also speaks to how we use the data. And in that sense, obviously, it can be not neutral because using data that is biased or using data in a way that that can be unfair is obviously not neutral. So I think that question really needs some disambiguation before we can answer it. But there's also another aspect in which I think it may be a trick question in many contexts. And this is that somehow I feel it could support a narrative that we see very often played out on social media, by the way, between people who defend the view that data is neutral and in the sense is less biased than, for example, decision made algorithmically by using data can be less biased than similar human decisions, versus people who point out how the fact that data is socially produced and reflective of our social realities leads to severe biases. And I think, so in a way, asking the questions in this term, whether data is neutral, can be polarizing and pointing in somewhat in the wrong direction. So I will put this thought here, and I'm curious, I am looking forward to what others think about this issue. I find this a trick question, to be honest.
Well, I just want to jump in real fast because I agree with everything that you said, Sylvia, and appreciate your clarification around that. And obviously the biases that come from collecting data lead to, I guess it's still the nuances between an individual node of data versus a data set versus how data is being used versus how data was collected. But I'm completely with you on the nuances. Yeah.
Yeah, I would jump in too here if I could. So yeah, completely agree with everything Sylvia was saying, especially the, if a data set is good, if it's a faithful representation of social reality, then it will reflect our biases and our inequalities back to us. And so the degree to which it does that, the degree to which it is a faithful representation, I think is an important sense in which it's not neutral. But I think, Jeff, I don't mean to put words into your mouth here, but I have a feeling some of what you might meant there is that we can never know ahead of time what information data could reveal about us. So we can never know the complete set of information that a particular record or a particular combination of data points could actually reveal. And this just has to do with, if I have my geolocation data by itself, that's potentially uninteresting. If I have my geolocation data plus timestamps for everything, and maybe I can lay that on top of Google Maps and see where businesses are, or see addresses or whatever it may be, then I can start to piece things together about my daily life that could be very interesting for different parties who, again, it'll be a variable or different interest, or it'll be informative in different ways to different parties. And so I like to think of data as this sort of starting point where when we collect it for maybe a particular reason, but that certainly doesn't mean that its value or its power is limited to just that purpose we collected it for. And I think we see that in European data protection law. That aspect of it is reflected, the sort of latent power of data.
All right. Okay. Does anyone else have anything to say on this issue? All right, and if not, I think perhaps now would be a good time to move into something a bit more specific, right? And I think, Jeff, in your documentary, one of the themes that you explored is actually surveillance capitalism, which shifts well into this next question of whether we should end the data economy and whether we should ban trades in personal data, right? Perhaps Megan or Jeff or Brent, maybe one of you guys can start.
So I feel like I've been kicking them all off, so I'm happy to defer to somebody else.
Yeah, I'm happy to, but I also just ended the last one, so I'm happy to defer to Megan or Sylvia if you want. Okay. If not, I mean, the two things that immediately come to mind are, and I mean, this is something that was mentioned in the documentary and actually goes towards what I was saying in the previous question, is that it's not so much personal data that is traded. I mean, it can be traded, of course, but it's not so much that's traded. It's audiences, it's information about people, it's profiles, it's groupings, it's the interesting things. You don't need to uniquely identify an individual in order to be able to learn interesting things about them and to serve them advertisements that might change their behavior. And so I think we can think of it in that way. That's could you end that, or could you ban that sort of trade? I guess in principle you could, but this is something that precedes the platforms that we're thinking about right now. This is, taking shortcuts, grouping people, having prejudices, having sort of intuitive groupings in your mind. That's just a aspect of human decision making and sort of human, let's say, social interaction. That I think you can't fully get away from. And we had advertisements being sold in newspapers and billboards and TV, and basically this is something that it's a very old problem. If we are thinking literally, though, just about somehow banning the collection of personal data by digital platforms, I really don't see how it's possible at this point, to be perfectly honest, but I'd be really interested to hear perspectives from the rest of the panel. Interesting idea, but I think we're probably about 2 decades too late to have that conversation.
Yeah, Megan?
I think for me, this question is incredibly difficult. And it's difficult because there's a line sort of in the documentary where it says, if you're not paying for the product, it's because you are the product. And I think that speaks a lot to what Brent was saying, that we might be a little too late when it comes to that. And so at this point, it's what are we doing with sort of data as now some sort of commodified asset? How are we sort of not policing, but regulating from the sort of asset perspective? And I think there's definitely a conversation that could be had there. But in part, I think the fear right now is that there's a sort of awareness that these things are happening to us. But something that we've seen sort of in the documentary is that even though these flags come up, they're sort of dismissed after a while, or they get watered down and then they don't get revisited again. And I think that's the problem with the sort of data economy, that everybody sort of knows or has some sort of icky feeling about it. But because there continues to lack sort of concrete proposals, and we don't know actually how to manage data being collected as an asset in a way, that the ban is probably not realistic at this point.
I'm happy to jump in. And I resonate with what Brent and Megan were both sharing just now. Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, I think her framing around surveillance capitalism is one that's been probably the most informative for me as an outsider and relative newcomer to this space and to this critique. The analogy that I'd like to just draw attention to is she frames what industrial capitalism did to nature is what surveillance capitalism is doing to human nature. That industrial capitalism figured out a way to take everything on planet Earth and turn it into some profitable, extractable resource. And we can harvest and sell most everything that the planet can produce. And now surveillance capitalism has done that to humanity, that we are the raw resource that it is sending its tentacles out to find and discover and to tap into ways that can monetize off of us. From that perspective, which I find accuracy not just a critique of the big social companies, but for a number of other tech companies as well that go beyond big social, then we're just, what are we? Like, humanity is now just literally being mined. Like, we are living in the matrix already, where our life experiences are just being tapped and exploited and extracted for financial gain. Like, that's a really depressing like worldview, that I do resonate with where Shoshana's coming from with that mindset. At the same time, I agree with what both of you were saying, was like, how do you even regulate that now? Shoshana's mindset is that we need to somehow outlaw, and she uses the word outlaw explicitly, but I am lost with what would be outlawed, or where we draw the line, or what the legislation would potentially look like to even wrap some sort of a container around, no, this is the thing that we're not going to do anymore, and how we're going to like treat humanity with respect when it comes to how the data is being extracted and exploited. So I likewise, I don't see what a path forward looks like, and I'm sort of stumped when considering those options. Yet still feel the tremendous anxiety around like, okay, are we just now, are we in the matrix, and is this what how we're being monetized?
Just one thing to add quickly to the end of that. So I think the right answer here is, of course, not to talk about extremes here, black and white, but to talk about what that regulatory gray area in the middle actually looks like, and are there specific things that we can do to change our, say, data privacy regulation or data protection regulation, to combat the, let's say, worst tendencies of surveillance capitalism. I think to that regard, I mean, based on what I was talking about before, it's really about what you can learn about a person from their data rather than their data itself. And a lot of the law that we have right now is based on regulating the data itself rather than the process of inferring things about a person, the process of categorizing people, of profiling people. So I think if we start to give individuals, or both individual and collective rights about around how your data can be used to group you, to profile you, then you may, just by adding a bit more weight to the other side of things, giving the consumer, giving the individual a bit more power to say no to a platform or to a tech company, maybe you start to see a positive change. It's not an overnight fix, but I think there is hope. There is regulatory hope, light at the end of the tunnel, where we can curb some of the worst excesses of the surveillance capitalism.
If I could just quickly sort of add on to what Brent's saying. One of the issues that I guess Brent was raising is sort of returning some of that power and allowing for users to, disagree or not use the social media platform. I think one of my personal concerns is that there aren't actually really equivalents. There's no real sort of market where I can say no to Twitter or no to WhatsApp. That right now, what we've seen with WhatsApp and this crazy frenzy around it, and people suddenly downloading Signal overnight or using Telegram and switching platforms, there's still sort of this hesitation, even though there's lowered rates in kind of downloading WhatsApp, people are realizing, and the way that sort of the change in privacy policy that happened there was, well, you're kind of holding hostage to some of your users. There's no real equivalent to what you can, I can't really say I'm going to get off Facebook, because what is the sort of parallel to that? It's not the same as a retail market where I can go to Walmart as opposed to Target or something like that. So that's, I think, part of the concern around returning some of that power to users is you have to make an active decision to completely unplug yourself, to sort of use that matrix analogy, which I really actually loved at the end of this sort of documentary where they were pulling out.
All right. Is there anyone else who would like to pitch in? All right, if not, I think our next question is a bit broader and perhaps even harder to answer, right? And it is that, given all of this conversation that we've been having, what do you think is the most prominent ethical concern linked to data, algorithm, and privacy, which we face in today's digital age? Right, perhaps Sylvia, would you like to kick this one off?
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a great question and a very difficult one, and it's hard to choose one thing that is the that I believe is the most significant one among many. But if I have to choose, I would say what concerns me most is the erosion of the public sphere and the way in which this is changing in ways that we're not familiar with. And I am sure that we, as a society, we will find new equilibria and new ways to inhabit our public sphere, and to deal with the polarizing effects that we are seeing online, for example, with the erosion of liberties. However, I think this is really the most concerning and pressing thing that we need to think about.
Would anyone else like to pitch in on this?
Everybody's avoiding the hard question. No. It's a really, really great question, Tian. I'm thinking through, similar to how Sylvia was just sharing. Like, for me, the erosion of truth and a shared sense of truth and respect for facts and understanding has been such a major concern in my mind. But when you ask, your question was around what's the most prominent ethical concern of how data is being used. Is that where you wanted to go?
Yeah, I think it's more a general question about, yes, what's the most prominent ethical concern linked to data and algorithm, or perhaps more generally, just, this entire sphere?
I guess, Brent, kind of what you were going to earlier around, like, is the problem the platforms, is the problem personalization, is the problem, like, there are all of these unknowns around where we're seeing, what's the root source of the consequences that we're seeing. A couple things to rule out in my mind. So we don't see, it's not like all algorithms are bad, right? The algorithms that we see in an Amazon shopping cart might make you want to buy more stuff, but you're going there knowing that you might buy stuff. And it's sort of a different sort of transparency with that platform around, I'm here for commercial exchange. You go to places like Netflix or Hulu or all of the streaming platforms, there's an algorithm feeding you content there, but we don't see misinformation and conspiracy theory and radicalization happening on those platforms. Those platforms have human curation, so everything is going through a human filter before it hits the platform. And those are subscription models in most cases. So there's a whole different structure there around that data being used. For me, the biggest, if I draw a circle around the biggest set of problems, I look at big social as being the place where we're finding most of the harmful consequences. So I put it on Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and I put Google and I put YouTube on that list as well, YouTube being Google's biggest sort of weak link there, where we have the combinations of user-generated content with unmoral algorithms at global scale with no guard, there's no protections, there's no FCC, there's no boundaries or guidelines around. All of those platforms get the benefits of publishing without the responsibilities of publishing. And it's something in those set of places where I think we find the greatest amounts of hate speech around violence, around breakdown of truth, around radicalization, and at the same time, all of the consequences that are happening to teens and mental health around self-image, increasing rates of suicide and depression. So for me, the ethical, like, one way to draw a circle around the problem set is the business model, right? This business model that has misaligned the incentives with us, the public, right? And when you apply that business model with the ability to reach anybody in the world, anybody who's connected to the internet can hop onto these platforms, driven through these financial incentives with unmoral algorithms running the show, that is like a complete, in my mindset, that's where we're feeling the breakdown of society. And it's happening at every different aspect which that technology can touch people and affect people, right? It affects a teenage kid a different way than it affects a political junkie versus somebody who's kind of radicalized on the extreme, but it affects all of us in the way that the algorithms have figured out how to reverse engineer us. And so that's my biggest concern.
I'll just quickly add something. I feel like I have to, because I'm a data ethicist, and if I don't answer the ethics question, it just seems wrong. I mean, to me, the two most pressing ones, the inferences, sort of uncontrolled ability to infer information about people from their data that I was talking about before. That's definitely one of them. But then, aside from that, there's lots of concerns around bias and discrimination in algorithmic decision making, in recommendation engines, and personalization in general. I think one of the real challenges we have there is to have a consistent way to see when things are going wrong, or to feel when things are going wrong. The sort of intuitive link that we used to have between, say, human decision making and actually experiencing something wrong that's not necessarily replicated in the space of algorithmic decision making. If you go to a job if you go to a job interview and you interview and you hear afterwards that actually the hiring manager is racist, then you can start to piece together one of the reasons that you didn't get the job. You don't have that same sort of intuitive link, or you don't have that same equivalent experience in the case of algorithmic decision making. So you may never know that you're being discriminated against, or that your privacy is being violated. We had this great example in the UK recently with the off-qual algorithm for A-level scores, for predicting A-level marks. And that was a really unique case, because it was a moment where everybody was talking about the same thing. Everybody was talking about the effect that that algorithm had on them in terms of predicting their exam results. And we started to have a conversation around discrimination in that, and discrimination in the prediction that was being made. That happened because we have an expectation that A-levels come out at a certain time of the year and they get discussed by students. I don't think we have equivalent events like that, where our attention is going to collectively be drawn to the outputs of algorithmic systems. And so my real fear is that we're going to take the biases, the prejudices that exist in the world, essentially train them into these systems, and then replicate them at scale without realizing that we're doing so.
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything that's been said. I think for me, one thing that continues to concern me is sort of from the creator side, the lack of diversity in sort of the creators, and that those who are sort of at the reins of these social media platforms, they're largely still controlled by white men. And this was something that was pointed to in the documentary as well. And I think the question around diversity and inclusion is still one that is not properly addressed, or there isn't really that much of a conversation on. And I think part of these missing narratives, and part of maybe the question around maybe we need intentional design to better these platforms, those are sort of avoided in ways and excluded. So I think, not that this is necessarily the ethical concern, but I think one that concerns me is, should we have more diverse voices in the sort of creative process?
Yeah, I think, having identified all these problems, that nicely leads to our very last question for today, actually, which is about what exactly can we do, right? So the question is, in the current state of regulation, right, is the current state of regulation regarding AI and data adequate? Yeah, perhaps Brent? I think you mentioned regulations earlier in the talk. Would you like to speak more on this?
I mean, I don't want to take up too much time here. I'll just reiterate what I said earlier about the regulations still focusing really on individuals, identifiable individuals and their data, as opposed to, so it's more focused on the input side of things when you actually collect the data, and less on what you actually do with it. So we see in European regulation, for example, it's not a loophole, it's by design, but basically if you de-identify personal data, you can do anything you want with it once it's de-identified. You can build profiles, you can build groups from that data, and then apply whatever you've learned back to individuals. And the individual has absolutely no say over what happens in the middle, over the actual process, the interesting process where you learn things about groups of people, where you create these profiles. And so closing that to me is the clear thing that would need to be done to make at least data protection regulation in Europe adequate. US is a completely different story. I won't go into that too much. And I should say, I think the regulation we have in Europe, the general data protection regulation, is fantastic. It's very strong. It's a fantastic start, but it's not perfect. And this is really the huge gap that exists, that if you start to address that question of what you learn about people from their data, then all of a sudden I think you get to a much better place in terms of fighting back against the sorts of things we're talking about.
Happy to jump in. I feel like in the United States, our government has not done anything really of note within this industry since its inception. I've recently met people who worked at tech companies from 10, 15, 20 years ago who were saying like they were the ones going and pushing our policy members in the US to not regulate the tech industry out of fear of stifling innovation. And they now feel terrible for what they were seeding, 15, 20 years ago. I think we have existing laws around the FCC and around broadcasting that would potentially be a very, very natural application. There are explicit rules and laws around broadcasting on television and radio that apply to those broadcasting mediums, yet don't apply to the internet, which is in many ways just another broadcasting medium. Could those be, applied in parallel, just with the internet in mind? I think one of the biggest gaps, though, is that there still seems to be a massive need for education amongst our politicians. So in terms of your question of is there anything that can be done from the perspective of the general public, I think the general public needs to just continue to elevate this to make our politicians pay more attention to this. Certainly here in the US, there's just starting to be, I think, especially with the 2020 election, there's just starting to be more attention from politicians around it. But that's just a first step. I think there's countless actual legislation that could be done, both around reinstating the fairness doctrine, which is something that we're struggling with here in the US around information. But I'll leave it at that. I think there's definite opportunity for more.
Maybe if I can briefly jump in on this, I think I agree with everything that Brent said. So essentially, I don't have much to add. But I think an important thing would also be to lower the bar for participation in these discussions. So especially for what concerns algorithmic inferences. So this is an area where I completely agree with Brent that is where the interesting things are happening. And it tends to be difficult for people to understand what is going on there for various reasons, because it's, business secrets or genuinely difficult things to understand. But this needs to change to some extent if we want to build more democratic accountability for AI and the tech industry in general. So I think there are some ideas floating around, but I think that's an area where I think most of the action needs to also be focused, lowering the bar for civic engagement.
Well, if no one has anything else to say, I think we should move on to the Q&A section. So briefly, with regards to regulation, someone has mentioned that Joe Biden was considering passing a law which would prevent Facebook from being sued for things that people post. So really what they're doing is extrapolating on vicarious liability. And I guess instead of coming from the point of view of government should regulate sort of big social, it should be themselves, and you'd enforce that through sort of lessening the requirements for vicarious liability and sort of forcing companies like Facebook, Google to self-police. So I think that could be directed to anyone. What are your opinions on that?
So I can't speak to the liability side of this so much, but the self-policing, I don't know, that feels like it's what we've been trying for, at least, well, 21 years, no, more than 21 years now. We've been trying it for quite a while. There's always this argument, sorry, I'm taking this in a different direction. There's always this argument that, regulation of any sort will stifle the tech industry and stifle innovation. We still hear that repeated in 2021, in the UK at least, when they're talking about new regulation, when Europe's talking about the new AI regulation. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have terribly great results from that in terms of the sorts of online harms and the prevalence of online harms that we see now. So whether we should treat platforms as publishers, that's a different question. But certainly something other than self-policing and self-regulation, I think, is what would be needed. At the very least, I'd love to see a regulatory agency exist that actually had the ability to go in and examine companies' systems, their source code, their algorithms, their data. I think that, yeah, I think that model is difficult because it requires a lot of expertise and resources, but I think that, I'd love to see that tried.
I want to definitely just plus one the last point that Brent was making around algorithmic auditing. Like, I feel like we need some sense of transparency with private corporations, that we can go in and confirm that you're not using a biased data set and applying it in a racist way. Like that should be a foundational, fundamental part of some system that we get to oversee and review and make sure we're not causing harm that the companies aren't even aware of. Yeah.
Okay, another question was, should social media platforms play an active role in combating fake news? So again, I think that's leading on from the idea of, if you cause the problem, you should fix the problem, sort of line of thinking.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the previous question and the point Brent was making around, should they be regulated as publishers? I mean, just pausing on the specifics of that question, should they be regulating fake news? Look at it from the opposite perspective of, what does our information ecosystem look like today, right? We have laws in place that have some sense of boundaries of what publishers are allowed to say, and they can't just make up lies on publishing outlets, and those laws aren't necessarily always being enforced, but there are some rules in place around certainly television and radio. The way Section 230, and in many ways the previous question sort of sounded like there's a notion of revoking or repealing Section 230. The current situation is that nobody's responsible, right? Like it's just like a free-for-all, and it goes back to the point earlier around user-generated content, where we don't see problems coming out of the places that are still algorithmically driven but have human curation of the content. But when you allow anybody in the public to say anything that can reach as many number of people as you want, with no fact-checking, no rules, no ethics, no journalistic values imposed on it, now that's what we're dealing with right now. So in my mind, it really there are one of two paths. Either the responsibility falls on the publisher, Facebook, the platform, or Twitter, or fill in the blank. Either the responsibility has to be on the platform, or the responsibility has to be on the individual. And we haven't really pursued either of those paths around enforcement or review. So I think that's the first decision point to be made, is like, we need to go down one of those paths. There has to be some accountability and enforcement in the system. There's another, let me just throw one other thought out there, because there's another part of the problem here, which our technology has allowed, which is where we get into free speech and concerns around that, which is scale. Freedom of speech is a different thing than freedom of reach. If you want to stand on the corner with a megaphone and blast out whatever you want, the government in the United States, the government can't arrest you for saying certain things, but you're only going to reach 100 people or so, right? How many people are you going to be able to get your message out to? And then a bunch of people are going to refute that, right? So the laws and the systems that we know work well in the physical world, how do we best modify and adapt those to the digital world? Where one of the concepts that a lot of the engineers spoke about was the Dunbar number, and how many relationships a human can actually naturally carry in their lives. Like, you can only have a certain number of friendships and relationships where it becomes beyond that sense of scale. So if you can have 150 friendships, yet on Facebook, you can think that you have thousands of friends and you can put a message out to thousands and thousands of people. Inherently, there's an imbalance of how the platforms are designed around human scale that has been in many ways the opportunity of the technology, but also, in my mind, potentially part of the downfall, where by removing friction from the system, which was the intent, right? Facebook's mindset was move fast and break things. Well, they moved fast and they broke things, and now, like, we do need some sense of friction at some levels of the systems.
I think in part this might touch back on our discussion on trust and sort of rebuilding that trust towards information and expertise. And how I see it is sort of like the creation of Wikipedia. I think people often use Wikipedia. It's sort of this open, crowdsourced way to access information. But many people realize that there could be errors and there could be sort of mistakes in sort of the information that is being conveyed. And I think part of it is that we've transformed social media into these beacons of truth when we need to find a way instead to sort of go back to that almost Wikipedia sense, that we have more of awareness that we need to take this information with a grain of salt, whether or not it's this individual reality that is different from, you know, another person's reality. So I think how we go about that, again, I am terrible with this question, probably won't provide a good answer to that. So I defer to Brent, of course. But I think for me, at least, I regard that this sort of dissolution of trust, we need to bring it back to sort of how do we make this information to a point that we know that it might not be true. And I think that that's something that maybe we'll have to work on.
I have a question regarding surveillance capitalism. Someone asked whether we could make sort of the concept of data more morally acceptable if, for example, you could see and tangibly feel the profits of people using your data. So I'm guessing they're suggesting some sort of system of when you get a box from whatever website you're using and it says, can we use your data? And you click yes, you get like £5 PayPal to you. So maybe that was a suggestion of, would that ethically sit easier with society, and instead of changing and sort of going all cold turkey on social media and allowing people to use our data, whether we could sort of get in on the act of that monetization of your data.
I have some thoughts on this, unless anybody, I'll jump in. You guys might need to start calling on us individually just to kick it off, but there are some new platforms that I've heard of that are trying to build new systems where the users are the ones profiting off of the interpretation and the rendering of their data. And it seems interesting in some ways around building a completely new system where there is no middleman and you're getting compensated directly for the rendering of your data. However, in the examples that I've seen thus far, it seems to just employ like even more problematic aspects of the attention economy. And so now everybody is incentivized to just make whatever types of content so that you're getting monetized directly. And it's just yet another set of problems. Like, so I don't know. We have these overlapping challenges of surveillance capitalism and the attention economy as being part of that. And I think it would, to the point of the question, I think it would be valuable for the public to know how much data is being collected about them at what times. Like, how many data points does fill in the blank company have about you? I mean, these are in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of data points on us, where when people have requested it, you get these like massive files of what they know about you. I think that is just one point of shocking realization for the public. And then to add, based on where the question was coming from, I think it would be a meaningful note, but I don't think that's going to solve the fundamental underlying challenges that we're facing. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting idea.
And I think we have time for one last question. So again, this doesn't seem to be directed to anyone in particular. So if you just feel like you have a thought, go for it. What do you make of Facebook and Twitter's decision to suspend Trump's account? Is this the right way to balance free speech and protection of other values? Would contextualization and tagging have worked better?
I'll jump in on this, but I'm just mindful if anybody else wants to answer, because I've been talking a lot. Okay. To me, I'm surprised they didn't take the decision sooner, to be honest, because of the flagrant disregard for the terms of service of the platforms. It was disappointing to see that they would give sort of a pass to a public figure for as long as they did, and then it finally got to it took a literal insurrection to to get to the point where they enforced their own policy. I mean, Twitter at least tried the contextualization and tagging option with, especially around the election, misinformation, tagging a lot of Trump's tweets, for example, as disputed at the very least, and that was a welcome change. That was nice to see. But essentially, I feel like they tried that and warned on several occasions that certain things were breaking their terms of service. So to me, they were entirely within their rights to suspend the accounts at that point. Yeah, I'm just disappointed to have not seen it sooner during his presidency, but that's a personal view.
I echo the same thoughts that Brent just shared. Yeah.
Well, we've actually run over a little bit. So just want to say from OFLS, thank you very much to all the panelists for coming and for all the audience and the great questions. So just a reminder, the recording will be up on our YouTube channel, and equally, if you want to continue on with the Legal Tech 101 workshops, which are being run by Tian throughout this term, please come along to those sessions. They should be very illuminating. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.